Thank you very much for this very nice introduction and raising some very important questions, Rada. And I would like to thank the team of the New World Summit, of course, for providing us with this platform. And I thank all of the participants for coming here. And I hope we can really come up with some practical steps after this summit to strengthen what we will talk about now in a minute, transnational revolution. Because we have always said in the Kurdish freedom movement that we can never achieve freedom in isolation. We can never be free if our brothers and sisters and other communities are not free. We can never be free if women are not free, because that is our red line. So in that sense, I would like to talk about a couple of these issues. But before I do that, some people like Jos Jongeden have already mentioned that right now, as we speak, there is an all-out war going on in Bakur, North Kurdistan, Turkish-occupied Kurdistan. And several people are trapped in a basement, and 7 of them have already been killed. In places such as Cizre, Silopi, Nusaybin, and other places in North Kurdistan, the Turkish army is besieging the population. It is killing indiscriminately the civilians that dare to go outside because of these so-called, curfews, even though the translation would not be correct. And we can see that exactly what Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, did 1.5 years ago in Kobani, the siege of a city, an all-out attack on a city. But also the resistance. We can see the same thing being repeated at the moment. We can see that the Turkish army is doing the exact same thing that Daesh did in Kobani, but is doing that now against the Kurdish population in Bakur. But nobody cares because this is the 2nd largest NATO army. Because nobody cares because Turkey will keep the refugees out of Europe. Because Europe actually encourages the policy of the same state that causes all these refugees to flee due to its policy of active military, financial, logistical support for the so-called Islamic State. And at the same time that we speak now, the so-called Geneva III conference is either halfway taking place, is supposed to take place, whatever. They were supposed to take place this week. Today also marks the 2nd-year anniversary of the announcement of Afrin canton, one of the 3 cantons of Rojava, Kobani, Afrin, and Cizre. Actually, exactly 2 years ago, in January 2014, the Geneva II conference, which is basically the forerunner of this year's conference, Geneva III, was supposed to find a solution to the war in Syria by the same powers who have caused the problems in Syria. And of course, it failed because it was planned. It was supposed to fail. At that time, the same people who had started to form their democratic self-governance structures together with all the communities who live there and with women as pioneers of a new society were excluded from the Geneva II talks. And the same week, the people of Rojava announced their 3 autonomous cantons. Last year, in January 2015, on the same week of January, on the anniversary of the announcement of the 3 cantons, Kobani became the city that defeated ISIS. On the same day that the Kobani canton was announced, the women and men, different people from around the world even joined them to liberate Kobani. And Kobani wrote itself down in history. It was not written down by the rulers, but the people in Kobani, the democratic forces of the world, wrote down history as Kobani became to be known as the city that defeated ISIS. And at the moment, again 1 year later, the same week in January, we see the Geneva III conference on the agenda, and of course it is supposed to fail. And actually, we need to understand when we talk about these things that this is a message. The fact that the Kurds, and with them all of the other communities that have worked together to form this self-governance, this alternative in the Middle East, the fact that they are not invited to Geneva III, but that reactionary forces, fascists, killers, rapists are invited, is a message. This is being done consciously. This is an ideological attack. And this isn't just an attack for the Kurdish people. This should be understood as an attack on all people who believe in freedom and democracy. And I'm not saying this in the classical sense, but in real freedom around the world. This is a message to the peoples who struggle around the world to say, no, actually we will not allow another world to be possible. The status quo does not want peace in Syria. We all need to understand that. And if we analyze this situation, the exclusion of the most democratic forces, the only people who really meaningfully have an alternative to Daesh, that they're being excluded, this is done on purpose. So we shouldn't have any illusions about the fact that this is some kind of big power game. No, this is something very conscious. I want to talk about ideological attacks in general, because I think the status quo system of the world is establishing itself through many different ideological attacks, especially on two instances. Ideological attacks on community, on the society, and secondly, maybe more crucially, on women. I will elaborate on that. As I've said, the resistance in Rojava has become a perspective for the world. And the status quo is establishing itself through different forms of regimes, like thought regimes, truth regimes, with its own media, its security apparatuses, its own history writing, to legitimize and justify the omnipresence of the state. It violates, it brutalizes, it enslaves, it imprisons people, society, to legitimize itself. And we have seen several talks on that regarding the definition of terrorism, prison systems, surveillance, the silencing of dissent, criminalization, and so on. We've heard examples about that already. Dominant history writing, which denies the history of the marginalized, of the excluded, the poor, women, the indigenous people, is also a conscious tool, an ideological tool to suffocate society and to especially legitimize the idea, the ideological nation state. So we can say, in fact, it has created a mentality, an enslaved mentality, which kind of makes us believe that the state is fate, that the status quo in which we live in is fate, that this is just the normal progress of history, that the suffering that we endure right now, the fact that so many people can drown in the Mediterranean, is just some kind of part of the system. This the system has done through ideological attacks, through establishing itself first in our mentalities. When we look at economy, we can see that absolutely everything has been stolen from us. What is left for us? We can say definitely in the name of industry, in the name of progress, in the name of modernity, the environment has been completely destroyed, indigenous communities have been annihilated, history has been rewritten, and we have nothing left. We're poorer than we have ever been. Everything has been taken away from us in the name of wealth and profit and so on. The nation state is a special ideological tool. It has the monopoly on society, and it justifies several forms of oppression, and it's a synthesis of capitalism, the state, and patriarchy. It's interesting to see that all parts of the state, its economy, its claims for security, its social services, they have all mobilized themselves against society. They have done all they can in their power to mobilize and organize themselves against the community. Secondly, these ideological attacks especially target women, and we need to problematize the idea, the concept, the reality of patriarchy very well in order to understand the problems that we face as humans today. We can definitely see and say that without any question, I believe, that history has simply been stolen from women. Women are not present in history. This is a conscious attack to enslave half of humanity in order to justify further forms of oppression, which in some ways or others are in fact extensions or multiple different forms of the same form of oppression. Patriarchy is ultimately based on subjugation, hierarchy, hegemony, enslavement, the abuse of power. So in many ways, the struggle of women and their oppression has universal characteristics. And if we look at the situation of women through that lens, I think we can organize our ways of struggle even more. We already have a transnational revolution, a potentially transnational revolution, which would be the revolution of women. And we can also, of course, it was again Jos Jongaden who mentioned Ekin Van, a guerrilla fighter who has been killed and then stripped naked and then displayed on the streets by the Turkish army. And what does this mean? This is a message to struggling women. This is an attack on women who struggle, who dare to pose a threat to the dominant system, displaying her naked, making her vulnerable, but she's a struggling woman. She will not be dishonored by being naked. Other women have been killed over the last 6 months by the attacks of the Turkish army, such as Berivan Şengal, a young Yazidi woman who, after the genocide and feminicide of Daesh on the Yazidi community, one of the most ancient communities in the world that still exist, after they have been killed, raped, enslaved, and sold as sex slaves, women like Berivan Şengal have joined freedom movements. She has joined the guerrilla in the mountains, and she was also killed by the bombardment of the Turkish state. So, of course, yes, these are very terrible things. And when we talk about transnational revolution, we need to be more enthusiastic, perhaps. But we first of all have to understand the urgency of the system in which we live in and all of our responsibilities. We have seen, of course, over the last year, and especially a year and a half ago, it began with the fight of the so-called Daesh against Kurdish women in Kobani, which became a new perspective, a source of hope for struggling people around the world. Of course, Dr. Rata Sousa, she mentioned already how students in India are now organizing their panels on the Kurdish movement. We can say this had very universal traits because it became a perspective for anti-system movements around the world. Because it seemed almost like these two extremes were just so obvious, but people, of course, in many ways misunderstood what was actually going on there. This wasn't a clash of civilizations between East and West or whatever, between religion and secularism or whatever. In fact, this is a clash between two civilizations, but not the way the dominant system wants us to believe. I will elaborate on that. The fact that on one side you had this system of darkness, of destruction, that was just aiming to kill and rape and just destroy women systematically, to draw all the colors of the Middle East, which is a beautiful mosaic in black, just like its dark flag. You know, it's the fact that it has the same thought schemes like the nation-state system, one nation, one religion, one flag, just one man on top and everyone else has to obey. And on the other hand, you had smiling women whose history has never been written as Kurds and as women, and especially as Kurdish women, that they were the ones who had the ideological as well as the emotional tools to defeat an enemy like that was not a coincidence. And we need to realize what was going on there, in fact. Just like it was not a coincidence that it was Kurdish women who had the heart and the power, not in the sense of the way the dominant system describes power, had the power and ability to defeat such an enemy. We will actually see that this isn't a coincidence if we look at the geography. Mesopotamia is a place where actually the first state-like institution began with the ancient Sumer. This is the same place where the first ideas, the concepts of private property developed. This is also the same place where patriarchy began to institutionalize itself. This is the place where we see in ancient mythology women fall, women clash with male gods, female goddesses being destroyed. We can see this. There's enough archaeological evidence to suggest that. But this is, this is the same place where basically the forerunners of the modern nation state, capitalism and patriarchy began. This is also the same place where the first word for the concept of freedom developed, amargi, which means freedom. And coincidentally, but I don't think it's a coincidence, it also means the return to the mother. So the same place where all these forms of oppression began is also the same place where the first idea of freedom is believed to have emerged. So in that sense, if we look at that, we can see there is actually a civilizational battle going on, but it's not the classical kind of dominant history writing kind of civilization clash, described most prominently by Samuel Huntington, but it is a clash between the statist civilization, the hegemonic, mainstream, dominant civilization, and the civilization of the oppressed. The Kurdish freedom movement, and most prominently the ideological leader, representative, Abdullah Öcalan, usually speaks of two civilizations. One is the mainstream civilization, and one is the democratic civilization. So on one hand, you always, throughout 5,000 years of history, you had these empires, kingdoms, now you have nation states, you have even transnational agreements, institutions, and so on, who always built their system of oppression and in a very conscious way. But on the other hand, you always had resistance. You always had democratic struggles, or maybe we don't want to use the word democratic, we can use something else, resistance struggles of the oppressed, of the excluded, of the marginalized, of the indigenous, and of women. So in that sense, if we understand what's going on in these terms, I think we will understand also ways of mobilizing against it. We can see that it is not a coincidence, for example, that in the lands of Chiapas, the Zapatistas have become an inspiration for struggling people around the world with their new articulations of what autonomy, emancipation, and freedom means. It's not a coincidence that the struggle of the Palestinian people has become an issue of honor and dignity for struggling people around the world. It's not a coincidence that now the most marginalized, the most brutalized, violated, killed, and imprisoned people in places like the United States now chant Black Lives Matter and have become the pioneering force of democracy in the United States. These are not coincidences, that struggles, that new perspectives, new paradigms all come from the places of the voices of the most marginalized, of the most excluded. And this is what we mean when we say there is a democratic civilization going on. And if we understand ourselves within this stream, I think we will have a much more confident way of mobilizing against the status quo system. So what all these things have in common is basically, we can say, humanity's desire to express itself as freedom. It's based on collective memories of contexts, of communities, where there is still a collective memory of the fact that things were not like this before. Those who have been excluded by the status system still have certain social characteristics that they still carry with them, and they have maintained them through maybe millennia of self-defense. And we've already defined self-defense as something beyond just merely physical self-defense. They have still retained those elements. And they are now those who are mobilizing this. So of course, against the nation-state system, which has just arbitrarily drawn borders like rulers, we've actually spoken about 100-year anniversaries. This year also marks the 100-year anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is basically when the French and the British took a ruler like this and just drew a line and said, this is now Iraq and this is Syria. Just very easy like that. And we can see the consequences of that still happening today, and the same states refuse to take refugees from those places. So we can see how capitalism has brutalized the entire world, how it has stolen everything from us, how it has just completely destroyed the environment. And we can see how patriarchy, maybe most recently manifested in the genocide and feminicide committed by forces like Daesh, has once again just gone beyond its own limits. So I was in Shengal, or the official name is Sinjar, the homeland of the Yazidi people, who have suffered the most brutal forms of genocide in the recent past. I've said that before, where women were just killed, raped, and enslaved. And for me, it was just the most historic moment ever to see that the answer of these women was, they were actually building their own women's council of Yazidi women. They were saying the only way to survive now is to organize. The only way to survive in a meaningful way is to mobilize, organize ourselves. So I want to slowly conclude because I don't have much time. I think we need to see statelessness, for those of us who are classified as stateless nations, this is actually a chance. We have a chance, we are in an advantageous position because we were always excluded from this really messed up, dirty system. And this can be a platform of resistance for us. The only way to survive in a meaningful way, to define our existence beyond mere physical existence, is self-defense. We have no other choice. We have heard Zuhad Kobani already talk about how we need to ideologically mobilize. So, a couple of proposals perhaps before I can conclude. Ideologically, we need to come up with new science paradigms. We need to read history anew in order to analyze what has gone wrong. The history has been written by the rulers. We cannot understand our resistance by going by the same history. We need to have alternative academies. And these need to be in confederal structures because local knowledge is everywhere. We need to recover that. We need to benefit from thousands of years old knowledge. Against the nation state, we need to strengthen the idea of the democratic nation. Against the nation state, democratic nation, in which all people will be part of a nation based on principles rather than ethnicity or religion. Against capitalism, we need ecology. Against the system of security and surveillance and prisons, we need to have a new system based on trust, on empathy, on ethical values again. Of course, these are very difficult things to mobilize, but we can see examples like that across the world, and maybe most recently in Rojava. And of course, women's liberation must be our red line. Whenever I see a woman, if I call myself a freedom fighter, I must see a strategic ally in that woman's eyes. Without women's liberation, forget any talk about change or revolution for that matter. Against the statist ideas of foreign policy and so on, we need people's diplomacy. We, the struggling people, we need to be in touch with each other rather than competing about who's more oppressed. We need to build common grounds on how we can struggle. If I see a refugee dying and stranding somewhere, and if my first question is, was that Kurdish or Arab? I am already wrong. I cannot talk about democracy or freedom or anything like that. All of these things will require sacrifice, solidarity, and we need education. And education not in this narrow sense of I'm going to read something and then I lecture or whatever. We need to educate a politically conscious society. Our friends have already mentioned the idea of ethical political society, where we understand why we face the issues that we face and how we can liberate our mentalities. So in that sense, we must really question why the status quo, why the whole system has mobilized itself so efficiently, and we, as those who really have something at stake here, our lives, our place in history, are so defenseless, are so vulnerable because we do not cooperate with each other. Our self-defense will be our empathy, our love, the conscience, the ethics, the morality that we still have, but that the system has not. This can be our strongest weapon. So, in that sense, let's build our democratic confederalist structures globally. Let's build our autonomies locally, give each other perspectives, but also make these global confederations. And of course, women's autonomous structures everywhere in the world, they need to be our red lines. I think especially this question is where the Kurdish freedom movement can be of perspective for struggles around the world. That without the social revolution initiated decades ago in Kurdistan, you wouldn't see Kurdish women fighting against Daesh today, because this is not the real issue at hand. It's about ideological self-defense. So just my last words, nobody is here to do it for us. We will have to do it ourselves. And we have to see that women will be the pioneers of our new system. We have to build our alternatives. We have to build a new paradigm, a new structure, a new system, together with all struggling peoples, because this is a clash, a war of civilizations, but not between different communities, but between different mentalities. And so I would like to just end by saluting all struggling peoples around the world, saluting people who struggle wherever they are, but especially right now in Cizre, where the people really need they don't need our attention, they really need our resistance, they need our revolution, they need our power, because the system is not afraid to kill them. The system is really not afraid to kill them. An EU member, NATO partner, whatever. We see the fight of Kobani as a universal struggle. It's not a Kurdish struggle. It was a struggle of humanity, and that's why I really want to salute especially the struggling women around the world, and want to end with this, something that I've heard a lot in Bakur, where people say, and this, if we look at it from a universal internationalist perspective and see Daesh and also the Kurdish freedom movement are not just two unique cases, but they actually have universal traits, we can say the more Daesh or ISIS, the more Daesh they become, the more Kobani will get. And if this can be our international struggle, I think we can get very far. And I wish you all the best of success, but without cooperation, we cannot function. Thank you very much for your attention.